Hello, everyone, and welcome to Media Literacy Basics. So we are going to briefly discuss all kinds of media today, but we're really going to be focusing on news in this workshop and across the other two that we will be having this month. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Jessica Keebler, and I am an instructional services librarian at the Mortola Library. And I am presenting today with Megan McGibney, an English adjunct professor at the New York City campus. So what are we going to talk about in today's session? First, we'll define what media literacy is. We will talk about what and who are the media. We'll talk about what happens when the media goes wrong. And then we'll talk about some strategies and examples for navigating media. So let's take a look at a definition.
Media literacy is not only the ability to understand information being presented to us, but also determining the best way to respond to it. When we say media, we are speaking about the way people communicate around the world, whether it is through print, radio and television, the internet, or new forms of media. For the past century, mass media has been produced by corporations or state entities that control the content of messages communicated to the public. These organizations edit news, advertising, and other information before the public sees the final product. New digital technologies, such as social media, allow for a new, freer flow of information. No longer do we rely solely on one source of information, but our information comes from a wide variety of sources. In addition, each and every person has the ability to contribute to the public exchange of knowledge. Of course, the information that we receive may still be biased, so it is important that we understand how messages are created and consumed in all forms of media. This understanding is the definition of media literacy.
So that's a basic definition of media literacy and how it has developed. So it's the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So notice that creating information and using information responsibly are also parts of media literacy, not just consuming. So when you share information or create your own posts and videos, that is part of using media. So we just want you to take a moment, you can pause the video if you need to, and just reflect on your own news and media consumption. So how confident do you feel in navigating the news? Or how confident do you feel in navigating other forms of media as well? So what does media look like? Because in the span of a day, you may encounter tweets, books, videos, website articles, advertisements, and there may be cases of hybrid media like this paid post from IBM on the New York Times, which is really an ad and an article. So media sometimes spans types of sources. And as I just mentioned, sometimes ads look like articles and tweets can be news. So it's easy to see how the term media is really complex these days. So with that, let's step back and simplify for a bit. So the term media by definition is a format. And the first three here, print, radio, and television, still exist, obviously, but they're no longer the main way that people stay up to date with fast-moving information, such as news. And the web really started to become a format for news in the mid-1990s, but really became indispensable in the early 2000s, and that includes social media. And as we began to really see an increase over the past few decades of the term media being used to describe news as a whole, it's usually in a derogatory way to kind of express who controls the story, when really media is about format. Okay, so as the video mentioned, prior to the internet, news was more centralized into a few companies that edited the news. Television news really started to become more diverse in the 1980s, and that added more voices to the conversation. Then the internet kind of exploded and there was more competition and less people were paying for news subscriptions like physical papers for their house. So revenue decreased and there was a huge decentralization of news and a lot more different outlets, which leads us to now where there are so many places to get news and we really have to be savvy about reviewing each source and each individual piece of information. So if we look at the different location-based news outlets, we have our local news, which in New York, we could consider LoHUD, the Journal News for the Hudson Valley, is a local I guess county-sized paper, but you may have town newspapers too. Then there's more national coverage like the New York Times, although they do cover international, they do mostly America. And then there's international. There's BBC, Al Jazeera. There's lots of different international news organizations. But now media also includes all of these other news outlets at the bottom. All of these organizations have their own purposes, agendas, selection criteria for stories, and journalism standards. So, for example, infotainment is the term that we use for news that's meant to entertain. It provides you with information, but at the end of the day, the purpose is to make you laugh, like the Daily Show, or the Today Show to kind of get your day started. So they may present news stories, but they're going to present either the ones that are the most important for the day, or the ones that are just going to entertain you, make you laugh, make you smile. So there are some there is editorialization happening where they're selecting specific stories to tell you based on their purpose. Similarly with commentary news, they have to run for 24 hours a day, so they're going to be editorializing in a different way. They're going to be telling you either everything that you need to know or repeating the same things over and over again so that different viewers who join throughout the day will be able to get all of that information. And a lot of time those are very biased towards a particular ideological side. So those we really consider commentary versus straight objective news. There's also online magazines like The Atlantic and the National Review. They may also have print versions as well, or they may have completely transitioned online. Some of those are general in terms of their political leanings. Some are more conservative, some are more liberal. So you would just have to evaluate for that. And then there's commentary and company websites that are more geared towards trades. So CNET for computers, The Hollywood Reporter for the entertainment industry. And these are really geared towards telling people news in that particular arena. So take a second again, maybe you want to pause the video and just think a little bit. Where do you currently get your news? Were any of the places that you go represented in the previous slide? And then why do you get it there? So according to every news organization, the purpose may be to inform, but as media consumers, we should be evaluating how they're doing at that goal. We know that infotainment, such as the Today Show, is sharing news, but they're also eliminating some stories that they don't want to share during their feel-good time. News commentary like CNN and Fox have clear political biases, so it would seem like they're trying to persuade you to think like them. So does that mean that we avoid this media altogether? No, we don't have to. But we hope that across these sessions that we can explain how asking the right questions of both ourselves and the media that we're consuming that can help us determine what is most accurate, fair, and balanced. So these are some questions that you can ask yourself when you're navigating any type of media. So who created this? What's their goal? What is being left out? Are there other perspectives that are not represented? Do I agree with what's being said? Sometimes that can actually be causing us to lean towards confirmation bias. If I agree with it, I may be inclined to just believe it more without critically thinking about it. Who is it intended for? Is it for a particular group, a trade, a specific ideology? That kind of goes back to what their goal was. Who is it intended for? And whose voices are included or excluded? Should we seek out additional perspectives? Are all the stakeholders involved in the story quoted, or is their side being presented? So let's look at some examples. So this is an article from the Washington Times, and if we don't know whether or not this is a straight objective news source, we can look at their header. It says reliable reporting, the right opinion. And if we go to their about page, it'll confirm that right in this case means conservative. So that's the viewpoint that they're bringing to their journalism. We also want to note that it's an opinion piece. Sometimes that can be easy to miss when we're reading news websites because we're just scanning through as quickly as we possibly can. But it is an opinion. And opinion pieces are valuable because they do provide various perspectives on straight objective facts. But we do have to be aware that this is one person's opinion and not all of the facts of the story. So the headline is Joe Biden finally finds copy of Constitution on mask mandates. So we can ask ourselves, who created this media? What's their goal? As we said, it's a conservative media outlet, so their goal is to connect with their intended audience of conservatives. And it's this author's interpretation of the facts. So what's being left out? We may consider, if it's a conservative media outlet, that maybe there's another side that is missing. So we want to find what's factually accurate, consider the opinion, and then see if there are other facts to the story as well, in looking outside into other sources on this story. And then, do I agree with what's being said? It's very important to be in touch with your own emotions and opinions as you read, especially when you're reading other opinion pieces. So here's a little bit of the analysis itself. There's some highlighted portions. Add this to the reasons not to vote for Joe Biden. Actually, this should be a constitutional no duh. And it's what took him so long to reach this obvious conclusion. So, you know, one thing to look for when reading for bias, although we did establish this is an opinion piece, you want to be looking for emotional, sarcastic, insulting language. So it's their prerogative to approach it this way. But if you encounter this in what's being presented as a straight objective news story, that would be a problem. As I said, opinion pieces and their perspectives are valuable, but the problem is when we have only commentary and we forget to hold tight to the facts. That's when we can have hyperpolarization that we're kind of engaging in right now. So here's another perspective on the mask mandate story. This is actually from a straight objective news source, and it's not an opinion piece. It's from The Insider, which I Googled to find out a little more about them. They're an American media company known for publishing financial news. It's very recent. I think it was 2 days before the previous article. But notice the headline is a lot less emotional. It's a factual statement. Kamala Harris walks back Biden's call for a nationwide mandate to wear a mask. And here's some of the content. So Kamala Harris, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, walked back Joe Biden's promise for a nationwide mandate to wear a mask, saying that they will enforce a standard of mask wearing. It will not be a nationwide burden to wear a mask. So we kind of looked at who created this and what their goal is. Their goal seems to be to provide a objective, straight facts of what happened. And we can see in comparing this to the opinion piece that this one focused on the clarification of language from the Biden campaign, as opposed to their interpretation of the original statement. And in order to see what's being left out, we would want to read the rest of the article, see the facts that they present, and ask ourselves, are they providing a backstory? Are they explaining why this happened using the facts involved? Again, same thing, even though we're reading a straight opinion or a straight news piece rather than an opinion, we still want to be in touch with our emotions and opinions as we read. I might agree with this, so I might just wholeheartedly accept it as fact. But I want to, again, critically think and consider what's the truth. So here's another story called Absence of Coronavirus Aid Deal Prompts Blame Game in Washington. This is actually from the Wall Street Journal. So if I wasn't sure, I could check their bias and their leaning to verify that. This is presented as a straight news story. Again, a non-emotionally charged headline. It does say blame game, but that's actually pretty standard, right? We have to go past the headlines. Even if it was a slightly biased headline, we'd still want to go past the headline and really find out what the article says. So in the article, it says that Democrats privately hope that prospects of a larger deal will improve after the election. But then they say that Republicans are saying Democratic ambitions for a larger package block narrower help for households and businesses. So this is about a blame game. That's what they're saying the article is about. And you can see that they're considering both sides. They're not just looking at how one side is acting and saying that it's a blame game. So again, with things like this, we want to be sure of our opinion. And this seems to be intended for general audiences, although the Wall Street Journal is known for their business reporting. So they are taking kind of a financial angle as well. And later in the article, they quote someone else involved, the Senate Finance Committee Chair, Chuck Grassley, who's a Republican from Iowa. So he said, if you'd asked me 2 or 3 weeks ago, I'd say things are very, very negative, referring to the economic impact of no further stimulus aid. So they're talking to someone involved, someone who has a stake in this as a Senate Finance Committee Chairman. So again, we want to look for additional perspectives. They're going to add more context and facts. So the way we looked at the mask mandate article in 2 different places, we might want to look for information on this topic in additional places. So there's a website called allsides.com, and they do a nice side-by-side, like is shown here, from the center, from the right, and from the left, and how this information is being presented, and they will link to those articles. Sometimes it's not an easy split of, right, center, left. They do kind of make it very tidy and like it easily splits up, and that's not always the case, but sometimes it is very easy to see. So these are very openly biased sources, which we'd call sensationalist news. So, right, help alternate report the truth, Republicans' disgraceful relief bills, the real reason they're keeping Americans home. So a lot of this is trying to trigger emotions in you and trying to make you feel like you don't know the truth if you read other sources other than them. So if you choose to read these, be aware of your emotions, be aware of the facts that you know to be true, and be pretty skeptical. We'll look at an example right now. So this is actually an opinion piece. We'll start by saying that, but it is a really tiny note about it being an opinion piece. And it was right there on the main page. So this is called, While Fauci Tells US to Hunker Down, Sweden's No Lockdown Coronavirus Results Speak for Themselves. Sweden took the right path in response to the virus. Again, an opinion piece. They are entitled to presenting their perspective. But if we look at some of the content, it says that Sweden has been ridiculed as the country taking the dangerous and novel approach by shielding the vulnerable and letting the rest achieve herd immunity quickly. But if you know more about the facts of the case, they have not reached herd immunity now as of September 2020, and they did not reach it quickly. So that is non-factual information. It also says, despite having no lockdown, however, Sweden didn't lock down totally, but they did have strict regulations. And this, again, is something that's not reported in an entirely nuanced way that it actually occurred in the real world. And if we ask ourselves some of those previous questions before, what is the goal of this media? Who is it intended for? You can clearly see what the agenda is in trying to favor the Swedish response versus the American response. So what would this reporting look like in a more straight objective news source? So this is from Bloomberg, Swedish COVID infections drop after steady distancing patterns. So again, they are referencing that infections did drop. So they are acknowledging that, but they are saying that it was thanks to citizens voluntarily adhering to social distancing guidelines. So cultural differences in terms of voluntarily adhering to social distancing was not mentioned in the previous articles. Or the previous article. They also talk about the fact that Sweden's less stringent approach was done because they felt like if they had to have these in place for a long time, they should be less strict. And that's way more nuanced than saying no restrictions. So they had no lockdown, but yes, there were strict social distancing restrictions in place. And I believe the article does go into some examples of those as well. It also says that, ironically, places like Denmark and Norway have already rolled back their severe lockdowns, and now places like Norway and Finland have less restrictions than Sweden. So Sweden is more locked down than others now, and that was not addressed in the previous article. So you can see how this one is a much more fair and balanced view, and whereas the previous one cherry-picked a lot of information to fit what they were trying to say and to fit their argument. So again, another sensationalist news example, which we can use to kind of show the difference in in coverage and how important a variety of coverage is. So if I only got my news from Alternet, I would think that I was only getting one personal story, this woman's opinion on the cause of the fires, that it had to do with just Western capitalism. But that doesn't give me much factual information or context. But when I look at the New York Times coverage, we see a scientific perspective, a political view, updates from the ground, and you see how much there is to this complex issue. Again, does this say that New York Times is the perfect, always straight, unbiased news source? Absolutely not. But it shows that they have a variety of coverage and a variety of perspectives, as opposed to just sensationalist news stories. And they're grounded in fact, even if, again, there can be a little bit of bias at times. Things are nuanced and there's context. That's the main point. Or it's always valuable to go directly to a local source. Here is the Oregonian. This is only part of their local coverage, and you would actually be getting perspective from people living through this news of the wildfires. So whatever story that you're reading about, you know, what are the local news sources that might have an on-the-ground perspective? So those were some examples of actually applying those questions to news. But now let's talk a little bit about when media goes wrong. You know, how have we kind of become so polarized? And while that's a huge, complex answer, there are some specific problems to be aware of. So propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. So some examples would be like Russia Today, which is a government-run media. That means that anything critical of the government will not be shown, and they will purposely run information that's intended to support the state and harm its critics. And we can see how that could be manipulative and potentially dangerous. While it's really different, some consider CNN and Fox propaganda for each political party because they are so clearly biased. Another example of information being weaponized as propaganda, rather than like just a media outlet, is information being used in the mask wearing debate. You know, mask wearing has been used in a variety of ways to be equated with liberalism, a loss of rights, being anti-American, and being anti-mask wearing is being seen as supporting the president. So the memes, the articles, the videos that are spreading these ideas are intended to sway people in favor of their side, you know, making it almost a form of propaganda. Another dangerous use of information are conspiracy theories. They're a form of propaganda at times, and they involve incredibly detailed false stories. So one example was the InfoWars story that the Sandy Hook shooting was a made-up event to push an anti-gun agenda. As you can imagine, this was incredibly hurtful to the families, and it was an emotional trigger for many people. But the motives were to spread distrust in the government and the mainstream media and authority, who he believed was creating these mass shootings to push gun control. And the families have been subjected to harassment, to death threats from followers. So there were real consequences to these theories. And those are common conspiracy theory motives in terms of, you know, spreading distrust about the government and authority and what's true and not true. Another more recent phenomenon is QAnon itself, as well as the more specific Wayfair conspiracy. So QAnon is a lot more complex to define here, but as a movement, they're trying to recruit people who care about an issue like child trafficking, but in the end, they're not really helping anyone. Last month, they suggested that the company Wayfair was trafficking children through expensive items on their website. However, the hoax has caused issues for human trafficking organizations who have said, please stop calling us, because they don't have legitimate leads and they're clogging up the lines from people who have real tips. So big keywords to look for with conspiracy theories are we know the truth, or you're being lied to. And, you know, we could really do a whole session on conspiracy theories, but we're just touching on them in the harm that they do to real people and the media landscape when everything is nefarious and they're the only ones who know the truth. And then we have bots. So, you know, when used nefariously, they can be used like they have been on social media to create new posts, post false information, and generate confusion, because they're really just simple computer programs that automate tasks and make them easier. Bot farms have been accused as being part of Russian interference in the 2016 election by posting fake information about the political race and sowing distrust between people. So why are we spending so much time on these negative influences? Because they create chaos in the media landscape, which turn people away from real news. And it's important to be aware of that and recognize it when you see it. Oh, and memes. So we're just going to say it. Memes are a terrible way to consume information, especially news. And don't get me wrong, memes are amazing. They're one of the funnest ways to communicate, but they're problematic when they're masqueraded as informational. Why is that? Because they rarely have citations. They try to condense a nuanced topic into a single image. They usually only show one side of a situation. And they're biased in motivation usually, and they can be made by anyone. So here's an example. Why is this inaccurate about Mount Rushmore? Because here's a quote from the fact check on Snopes.com. So even though this meme highlighted key elements of Mount Rushmore's darkest history, some of its facts were incorrect or pulled out of necessary context. So the problem is that when history is taken out of context and all the facts are not shared, they become easy to manipulate. And that's because they're so easy to share, it can be spread too quickly to contain. It's actually very easy to spread misinformation and takes a lot more time to correct it. And then we have satire. So satire is really just a form of humor that uses irony, sarcasm, parody, and it pokes fun at kind of the absurdity of the world. The Onion is one of the best known outlets for satire. But you have to keep in mind that if you see them shared around, that it is satire, and it's meant to be funny, not real. And the problem is sometimes people don't realize that. So at one point, Sean Hannity and a congressman actually used the Onion articles both on television and in a committee without realizing that they were fake. So sometimes people can use this information in a way that's not accurate and create a lot of problems. So at this point, you might be saying, well, then what the heck am I supposed to believe? And this has also become a problem with our media landscape. So many people believe nothing. And that is really ripe for conspiracies and for people to think that everyone is manipulating them. The skeptic may just say, well, it's all fake, so I'm not going to believe anything. Or there's just people who believe everything that conforms to their worldview, which is also dangerous. So you want to be somewhere in the middle, just like junk food. A bit is okay, but too much is bad for the body. So for an example, you can Google a video that shows how one incorrect fact from a Microsoft report about human beings having an 8-second attention span was so widely believed because multiple news sources reported it over and over again without fact checking. So those people believed everything. But meanwhile, people are so skeptical of news that they think information on COVID-19 is a hoax. So both ends of the spectrum can be problematic. If the people in the 8-second attention span video had just taken a few seconds to fact check, they would have seen that wasn't calculated accurately. And if the people who believe COVID is a hoax are a little more open to factual information, we could all meet in the middle. So let's review the questions for navigating the media. We've already looked through those. And then there's also some red flags for news as well. So if you see sources with these red flags, you want to move on and find something else. So you're looking for emotional language, only one side of a situation presented, and a lack of references or citations. Or I might also say references that link within that same source. So they're providing themselves as their source. So here are some trusted news sources, and we say generally because, as we've already expressed, all media leaves out some part of the story. All media has a purpose, but that's not necessarily purposeful manipulation. They just have a particular purpose, and it has to fit your information need. So when there is so much information to present, journalists are writing to catch stories while having their own human biases, and it's really up to you as the reader to critically think, look for broader context, and to ask information. So do you feel more confident now in navigating the news? Notice the appropriate use of a meme, no misinformation in sight. And I'll leave you with this quote from the News Literacy Project. We need discourse, not debate. Debates have winners and losers, while discourse is a conversation.